the end. And if you would do evaluations, we really appreciate it too. Okay, so we had 4 sites in the county last year that we're going to do nitrogen plots with. And one happened to be the county farm. I guess I'll let Jordyn kind of go through that. Okay. Tonya Gratz, if you don't already know me, and then I'll pass it to Jordyn.
I'm Jordyn Sattler. I'm the Regional Crops and Soils Educator for UW Extension in Grant, Greene, Iowa, and Lafayette counties. Thanks for having us and sticking around. We're going to talk about these nitrogen use efficiency plots that we had in the county this past year. Tonya's going to start off talking why we're studying nitrogen, why it's important from the farmer's perspective and from her perspective as a land and water conservation specialist, and how this project kind of got started for us. And then I will take over talking a little bit more about what nitrogen use efficiency is, about the farms and the results that we saw locally, how to improve nitrogen use efficiency, and what we learned, how to conduct your own assessment, and some key points to take home with that.
Okay, so why study nitrogen? So I was trying to think of it from the farmer's perspective as to, am I using too much nitrogen? Can I be keeping some more money in my pocket? Or do I have yellow corn? I need to give it more to make more yield. And how do I tell if my nitrogen program is working and I'm getting the most bang for my buck? Like, where is that good spot that I need to be targeting? And would my corn, or would I grow any corn if I didn't have any nitrogen on? And some people think no, some people think yes. And so another aspect of this was that in Greene County we have a water coalition group. So we are looking at nitrates in groundwater, how we can do better. And so having this conversation of doing nitrogen plots on farmers' fields and talking about the results of do we have too much nitrogen or not enough nitrogen came out of that. And so we want to know, are we over-applying our nitrogen, which is going to contribute to the nitrates in our groundwater? What are the trends in groundwater testing showing for the county? And so if you didn't know, Greene County has a trends data set that they've been studying for the last 6 years. I think this last year is the 7th year. It was like 300 and some wells throughout the county. So like each of the dots on the left-hand side is representing a well. And so the coloring for that is showing for year 5, so in 2023, what their nitrate level was in their groundwater. And so 10 through 50 is that red color. So it's a fairly, Mike's talk this morning, he said 15% of the wells in Greene County are contaminated. I'd say they're probably 15 to 20% that we have. So 10 parts per million is our threshold. I should use this other thing. So the cutoff is at 10 parts per million, which is that it's supposed to be safe for drinking water and for pregnant women and babies and the like. So if we can have it under 10, that's in the more safe range. So this other chart, with those 5 years of data, now 6, soon to be 7, they were able to make some trends. So what's happening in our groundwater? So on this map here, it's showing those blue dots. The bigger the blue dot, the bigger the rate and change. So it's going down, the nitrate levels. So minus 7.5. The bigger red dots is also graduated based on the percent change. So it's going up in the trend from 0.5 to 3.25. mg per liter per year. So there's some places where it's going down, which is good. Some places it's staying the same. That's even better, I guess, if you've got decently low levels. And so to let you know that we are doing this data, or that data is out there, there is a website. I can send a link if anybody's interested to comb through the data stuff.
Tonya, was there any correlation between management practices near the wells that were going down compared to management practices towards the wells that were going up, or any trends like that?
I don't believe any of that has been evaluated yet that I'm aware of. So Victoria Solomon and Kevin Masaryk are kind of spearheading that data stuff. So I'm not for sure what other background information they've collected.
Yeah, I don't think there's been much background on that side of things collected, because all of these, the well sampling programs are all pretty volunteer basis from homeowners. So the people submitting these samples might not be running the land around them to know the management practices. It would take a little bit of overlaying certain data points to maybe get some of that information.
Is there a breakdown of the well depths in that, you know?
I don't think so.
I'm not sure if they have collected that data. I think they tried to gather as much information about the wells as they can, but I don't know that that's been, combed through and like have got anything ready to present, as far as I know.
Not that I'm aware of. But hopefully more to come. They're still hoping to continue this program, and the more data you can get on it, the more hopefully reliable the trends can end up being, and you go from there. But keep building. But with all of those concerns that the farmers were having, and from the land and water perspective, we thought nitrogen use efficiency would be a good assessment to kind of help guide some decisions in that way, and look at the nitrogen that's being used on farms. So what nitrogen use efficiency is it's an assessment tool farmers can use to compare the effectiveness of their management practices on their farm to those to other farms around the state. But essentially, in basic terms, what it is, we've got nitrogen inputs we're putting onto farms as fertilizer. It's got a number of places it could go. Where we really want it to go is into the plant and making yield, so we can take that away and get money for it. If it's going any of these other places, like being lost to leaching, runoff, denitrification, volatilizing to the atmosphere, it's not going to be efficient for us. So it's not just one specific thing that we're looking at when we're doing nitrogen use efficiency. There's actually 4 main questions being answered and calculations that go into it. So they're kind of broken up by standard and intensive. So standard is really basic information, super easy to collect this. All you need is, I hit the wrong button. Yield from your field and the number of pounds of nitrogen applied. Divide that gives us our partial factor productivity. How productive is this crop given the amount of nitrogen we applied? After that, we look at a partial nutrient balance. That's the nitrogen content of the harvested portion of the crop. So in all of the cases that we looked at in the county, it was for grain. If it can be done for silage too, then you'd be looking at the nitrogen in the whole above ground portion that was taken off. But to get a little bit more information about what our soils are truly capable of, we chose to go with a more intensive approach. So this meant incorporating a 0 nitrogen strip in with the trial information so we could have a little bit more comparative data to look at. So each of the participating farms did this 0 nitrogen strip to look at agronomic efficiency, which is the yield of strips with nitrogen minus the yield of strips without nitrogen added, and then divided by the difference in nitrogen there. So I kind of have it a little bit misworded here as far as and applied in the field with application, because there can be nitrogen applied to your zero nitrogen strip as long as it's under 30 pounds of nitrogen. It can still act in that zero nitrogen way. Basically, we don't want to discourage your DAP or MAP applications if you need that phosphate. Uptake efficiency, we didn't focus on a whole lot because that looks at the nitrogen content of the entire above ground plant. We didn't want to sample that since we were just taking grain. But there's a lot of factors that affect our nitrogen use efficiency. As you all know, since you've been farming before, basically anything that affects the nitrogen cycle is going to affect your efficiency. Things like soil type, sandy soils or poorly drained soils, they're more prone to different forms of loss. Higher organic matter supplies more nitrogen. Weather affects all of the movement within the system and then into the plant. But it's also important to remember that there are factors that are affecting the crop too, and not necessarily just the nitrogen. So like weather, if we don't get our rain at pollination time, our yield could be reduced just from that aspect. So our nitrogen use efficiency is going to look a little bit lower in those instances too. But all things to keep notes on. It also doesn't necessarily account for residual nitrogen if you've got some left over from the season before. That's something that we were concerned about with how dry 2023 was. We ended up doing pre-plant nitrate samples to kind of gauge where that was at, if it was going to be a factor. And the results we were seeing, none of them ended up coming back high enough to really throw off nitrogen rates that we would have to credit or anything. So that was interesting to see, which I wasn't completely surprised because there was some pretty good yields that year anyway. But a good thing to keep in mind if that kind of situation comes up again. So the benchmarks established in Wisconsin were created by the Discovery Farms Network. They're a group that works with a bunch of farms throughout Wisconsin doing monitoring of groundwater and many different things. But they looked at nitrogen use efficiency on farms across the state over 6 years. During that time, they were able to collect over 200 data points, and they charted all of that information into what they call a box and whisker graph, kind of like this one. So they plotted all of the nitrogen use efficiency values that they came up with for those 200 plus data points, and they divided it into 4 different parts. So there's the lower quarter, the next quarter, the mid-high quarter, and the high quarter. And that's where their benchmarks are kind of set up. So the data that they came up with, they split into 4 to kind of compare how others perform against it. They were only able to confidently make benchmarks for the partial factor productivity and partial nutrient balance. There was a lot of noise in the system. They would really like more data on agronomic efficiency and uptake efficiency in order to be able to confidently get benchmarks on those. So we'll talk a little bit about the farms that participated in this project. Ken Clark's farm is transitioning from dairy over to a cash grain operation. The field that we did the project on was a corn soybean rotation. It's had tillage, it gets variable rate potash. The phosphorus values are still pretty high from historical manure applications. And his approach to nitrogen was a single nitrogen application pre-plant. We'll get more into that later. Nick Bassler's was cash grain. He's got a more extended crop rotation. With this field was corn, beans, wheat, cover crop, and then back to corn. That cover crop ended up being taken for forage at the end of the summer or fall time last year. So a little bit different factor there, but it was no-till. Got DAP and potash in the fall. Had a little bit of a rye cover crop or some regrowth from that forage mix, and was a split nitrogen application there. A little bit lower on the soil test for phosphorus, potassium, still pretty good. And then Brian Fellers, beef and grain operation, corn, beans, cover crops. He did a vertical till pass on this field, had rye and hairy vetch as a cover crop, and there was quite a bit of biomass, which was great to see, and split application of nitrogen in a few different ways. So definitely a lot of manure there. Soil tests are pretty high, helping it be more productive. But I'll go into each of the farms specifically to talk about the setup of those plots and the results and how things kind of turned out, some takeaways. So we'll start with Clark's. We had a zero nitrogen treatment, which ended up being a true zero nitrogen, since there was no additional, no DAP or anything like that factored in. Then he applied 10,000 gallons of manure in the next strip, and then 20 gallons of 32%, and 40 gallons was his full rate. So the rates in between, the zero and the full rate, were kind of up for whatever people wanted to see on their farms. They're not necessarily required to do a nitrogen use efficiency assessment. They were just kind of for fun to get more data points. All of that nitrogen was applied pre-plant incorporated. So we took the drone out a few times throughout the summer. There was later summer when we looked. The first one is, July, and then we did August and September to try to see any differences. Just, it's more fun to have pictures and slideshows than charts, and we're going to have charts in a little bit, so I'm sorry. So our results. The partial factor productivity, how productive is this field compared to its nitrogen input? His ended up being a 68.82, which falls into the low to mid range on the Wisconsin benchmarks. What that really means is he was able to produce 1.22 bushels of corn per pound of nitrogen that he applied. So not too bad, could be a little bit better. And then his partial nutrient balance was a 0.85, falls into the mid-high range, but more nitrogen was applied than removed. These were calculated for the full nitrogen rate. One little caveat with the partial nutrient balance is that's something that can be tested in your grain, and if you want to get more detailed information, we used kind of the average that we recognize corn grain to have for nitrogen content. So it could change a little bit based on if you apply a whole bunch of nitrogen, not as much. You can get more detailed with the information. We kept it pretty simple for the sake of it being a fairly new project to us and learning along the way. But agronomic efficiency, he was a 29.38. So his corn produced an additional 0.53 bushels of corn per additional pound of nitrogen compared to the zero nitrogen strip. That's very wordy and very technical, and it's more fun to look at graphs. So I put his yield up here, and it's somewhere where we can kind of start to see some things and pick out like what's happening here. Why do we see a dip in nitrogen from the a dip in yield from the low nitrogen to the manure only? Well, we wouldn't typically expect to see something like that. We know that excess moisture affected this field and this hybrid especially. So if it had something to do with that, my guess is mineralization was impacted by the excess moisture. But overall, the nitrogen that was applied was pretty well utilized. This graph is showing the nitrogen applied in red and the pounds of nitrogen removed in the grain in gray, and then the difference in blue. So if there's a blue bar below the line, that means more nitrogen was removed from the system with the corn than what was applied. So a negative nutrient balance, and that's fine, that's good. Anything, oh no, I really need to practice this pointer, sorry. Anything above the line means more nitrogen was applied than removed. There's excess nitrogen in the system, and where is that going to end up at some point? We should be probably a little bit more concerned about. Sattler's plot, we got a little crazy. Nick will do that from time to time. His zero treatment was technically 30 units of nitrogen because of the DAP applied in the fall before. From there, we went to 10 gallons of 32% at side dress timing around V6, and then 20 gallons of 32% at that same timing. And then these higher rates got urea pre-plant also. So a little bit of everything out there. His pictures were more fun. But partial factor productivity in the low to mid range, a little bit lower than the other ones that we tested. He was able to produce just over a bushel of grain per pound of nitrogen, so not what we were hoping for or expecting, but we'll get into that. Partial nutrient balance was a little bit lower too, in the low to mid range, not bad though. 27.09 for agronomic efficiency. That means he was able to get almost a half bushel per additional pound of nitrogen over his zero application rate. So, so still something, probably not getting quite as much from the soil as what others are. But his graph kind of starts to paint a picture for me, and that's in the timing that the nitrogen was applied, which is, one of the many factors that affect the efficiency of the nitrogen getting into the plant and producing grain. So our low one here, just the fall applied DAP, I kind of wonder if the fall applied nitrogen stuck around for this crop, because it's not much better, well, it's definitely not better, but it's not much different than these other treatments that received only 10 gallons of 32 at side dress and 20 gallons of 32 at side dress. So it was a good thing we did that, but I would have expected it to be very different than that. In addition, we see a big bump when we get up into the treatments that had nitrogen applied pre-plant also. Possibly with the moisture, maybe the plants needed some of that nitrogen there earlier in the season than what they got it, and it, affected that early stage of grain development. But he's also got some, on his full rate, a little bit higher nitrogen that's still left in the system. Not as much was taken out of the system as what was applied, but we're getting into a bit of a territory where we kind of want to take a better look at that, as far as maybe we need to put a cover crop out there to try to trap this nitrogen. If it is still there, keep it from leaving the system, or do a pre-plant nitrate test to make sure it's there in the spring and see if we can maybe credit that in before we make another nitrogen application. The Feller plot had nitrogen applied in several different passes in kind of little doses. The zero nitrogen rate got just a little bit of starter at planting, and then a little bit of foliar with a fungicide later in the season. I call that a base treatment for the sake of saving space in here. But then we add 5 tons of manure to the next treatment. Pile on that 25 gallons of UAN blend, and then the full rate 40 gallons of the UAN blend too. So that ended up getting up to 210 units of nitrogen. There was chemical termination of the rye a couple weeks before planting, so that kind of helped get the nitrogen that was tied up in Lorei at some point back into the system to be available to the crop, and a little bit of vertical tillage to help get that manure in also. His pictures were the most fun because there was a pretty clear difference in where it didn't get manure and where it didn't get additional nitrogen. So he was able to get 1.24 bushels of corn per pound of nitrogen on his highest rate. Ended up in the mid-high category for partial nutrient balance also, and was able to get just under a half bushel per pound of additional nitrogen over his zero end strip also. His again kind of ended up being a little bit different than we would have expected with this manure application. But looking into it further, that manure applied was a bedding pack, so we have a suspicion that maybe the carbon to nitrogen ratio was a little too high on that product. Might have ended up tying up more nitrogen than it was able to provide to the system. So that's kind of what we're suspecting caused that dip there. But otherwise, everything did really well. It's a very productive soil to be getting 112 bushel corn off of 6.5 units of nitrogen is pretty incredible. So I know he's put a lot of work into his soil health practices and all of that, and I think it shows here. Because when we look at the organic matter of the different farms, they didn't vary that much. There's some differences in regular nutrients, and that does affect nitrogen use efficiency also, as far as uptake and the interactions that those nutrients have. But a very productive system overall. Some people might see this and wonder if it's okay to have such a negative balance in those cases. And there's a lot more research being done about that. But as far as right now, it seems like we could go a long time before we start seeing that nitrogen naturally supplied by the system decreasing significantly. There's trials being done, and we'll get more information on that. But it's an interesting concept right now. You have a question? Okay, sorry. So improving nitrogen use efficiency, the Discovery Farms Network had made these kind of decision tree boxes based on where your values fell within their benchmarks. But really what it comes down to is improving it. You either need to increase the corn or your yield for the nitrogen that you're applying, or decrease the nitrogen you're applying without impacting your yield. So it kind of goes through a series of decisions to help you figure out which strategy might be the best for your farm and your soil types. If there was something other than nitrogen, something like the weather or pests, it's important to take that into consideration. Nitrogen is not the only fault of a bad crop, but definitely wanting to take those credits for the nitrogen that you have applied, whether it be from manure or if you've got a legume cover crop that can supply a significant amount for you too. Some of the ones that I think would have maybe helped some of these guys would be split applications for anybody that hadn't been. Maybe looking at the ratio of split applications between them, and then moving any fall applied fertilizer into the spring to help that be a little bit more beneficial too. There's just a big amount of time between fall and spring that's kind of up in the air and out of our control. So taking more ownership of that in ways that we can help control it. I thought this one had a really interesting point in it. Reading through, it said that the Discovery Farms data set did not have any fields with nitrogen use efficiency in the upper 25% that applied greater than 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So that says to me, there does tend to be an over-application of nitrogen. If some of the better ones in the state are getting significant yields at the 180 pounds, it's possible to be able to drop those numbers and still be able to have profitable fields. But it's important to improve them because there's a significant financial impact as well as environmental. I've got a couple scenarios as far as the finances. The first one would be what happens when we increase our partial factor productivity and it's able to increase yield. If we could go from the low to mid range in the benchmarks, bump ourselves up to the mid to high range, we'd get an additional 2.7 bushels of corn per pound of nitrogen that we apply. So if we're really conservatively applying 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, we could get 27 bushels off of that same 100 pounds that we were applying before. Penciling that out with 450 corn, that's almost $33 an acre. So a fairly big impact from taking a look at these management practices and just tweaking and fine-tuning it to be a little bit better. Second scenario, say your yields are in a really good place, you're getting 244 bushels, you think that's what it should be for the soil that you've got. If you can increase your efficiencies in that same way, you could drop the nitrogen application that you're putting on. So that 244 bushel crop that you needed 210 pounds of nitrogen to achieve earlier, you can drop that down to 171 pounds of nitrogen and save yourself $21.45 an acre. So a pretty good savings while still maintaining that high yield if you're efficient with it.
Okay, and so we're talking about the environmental impact, and so we saw that in several occasions there was maybe some nitrogen left out in the system. What's going to happen to that? Hopefully it stays put, but likely it's not going to, and so by improving our nitrogen use by crops and removal reduces our nitrate leaching to groundwater. So this is a snapshot out of the Stevens Point well data viewer that has it by section in Greene County. Depending on how many wells are there, some of them don't have any data, but if we're doing orange and red, that's more than the 10 parts per million. So we have, kind of in our watershed, we're having more incidences of higher nitrates in the groundwater. And if you look at Rock County, they have an even worse problem. Not to say we're better than them, but we have to be careful. And then the public health concern. Nitrates in the groundwater creates problems for people drinking it, but then if you're drinking it and consuming nitrates, that's also potential to lead to cancer. So nitrates and cancer are connected. And so that's a overall public health that we need to be thinking about how we can impact that with our management decisions. And by having too much nitrogen in the system and it leaves the system, let's say it goes in the groundwater and continues down to the Mississippi, down to the Gulf, we have a hypoxia zone where it's dead. The shrimpers and the people that make their living by fishing the waters have to go farther and farther out because there's a dead zone, because we have taken our systems out of whack. They're out of balance. So we want to trying to think more about that. Jordyn, you love this first time. Okay. So what we learned, that there's always room for improvement, right? Don't be satisfied where you're at. We had a little meeting with our 3 farmers, and they seemed a little surprised by the nitrogen use efficiency. Often it was a little lower than what they were really hoping it would have been. We think we need to take more ownership of our cropping practices. Those are factors that we can control to manage risk. Like Dan had said, of doing no-till and cover crops, we're taking ownership of the things that we can do to help infiltrate. When we do get big rains, we're doing our part to keep the water on the landscape. If it does leave, keeping it clean. So we're trying to, that there are things that we can control that are in our realm. And nutrient management plans are a very good starting place for figuring out nitrogen rates and accounting for all nitrogen sources. And so Jordyn and I were talking about, well, how do we figure out what comes first, this nitrogen use efficiency or nutrient management plan? Well, we've kind of figured that if you have a nutrient management plan, it gives you a target. And if you build on that target, then you study and do the nitrogen use efficiency, you might decide that you don't need to be that high, or maybe could be a little bit, one way or another. So that's what we think is good for learning.
Okay. Oh, I can hustle. Okay. So conducting your own assessment, it's really fairly simple for these standard assessments. Very basic information that goes into it. All you need is your yield information and the nitrogen input. So most people have that readily available. They just haven't really technically done the math on it. You don't have to have your grain sampled for the nitrogen content. You can use that baseline number that's kind of a general average that we see. And then if you did want to get a little bit more into an intensive assessment, zero added nitrogen strips are really, honestly, a cool way to see what your soil is capable of. You could be surprised in a lot of different ways. And then nitrogen content of above ground biomass. But always be sure to track your values and monitor the effect of the management changes that you're making. It's good to kind of have that anecdotal, yeah, we saw this, but to have it written down and being very intentional about it is going to give you more purpose in getting these changes made and improving your systems. A few tips that we kind of put together as we were reflecting back on the season, we had trouble getting some accurate yield data from the county farm, which was disappointing, but we had 3 farms that did a really great job. Always make sure there's no hybrid changes in your area. That can throw things off. Size the plot for your equipment. Make sure everything's kind of going to match up so you don't have to worry about too much of goof in between. Mark your plots with flags and GPS points and share them with a friend and write it down and have it saved another place too, because somehow those flags just disappear on you. And if you're going to use your yield monitor for data, like I'm sure a lot of you might, make sure you calibrate it, and it helps to have a minimum plot length of at least 500 feet. And then always don't hesitate to ask for help. I know I'm always happy to be out in the field, and Tonya feels the same way. We've been through it once, and we'd like to do some more, I think. So, I would. I don't know about Tonya, but we're good resources to help with this and any other projects that you might have on your farm. We're really interested in learning from you guys because you're the experts. So take-home points. Nitrogen use efficiency is an easy assessment you can do on your farm. Can help improve profitability and enhance the environment. And you can't manage what you don't measure. So be very intentional about getting these data points, and it can help direct some of your decisions to make your farms better. But thank you very much. Thank you to Ken and Nick and Brian for letting us do this and letting us share their data too. I appreciate it. We learned a lot. So, thank you.
Do you guys have any questions? Do you want to stick around and ask questions? Any public questions? Dan.
I haven't even thought it through yet, so I'm going to think it through as I ask.
Okay.
Regarding the manure, where it was the second treatment where you actually get down because of the